Hello, everyone. Welcome to the WookieCast. I'm sitting down with E.K. Johnston, an author of several Star Wars young adult novels. And so thank you so much for sitting down with us.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
So I'd love to get into a little bit of how you first got into Star Wars as a fan.
I honestly don't remember not being a Star Wars fan. My older brother is 10 years older than I am. And he was the Star Wars fan before I was born. And so I was probably like maybe three or four. The first time I have a memory of Star Wars, which is listening to Return of the Jedi on vinyl, if you can believe it. And it just had this recording of Darth Vader's breathing. And like I didn't see the movies for years, but I still had that recording of the breathing that I always remember.
What was the first movie that you saw in theaters, if you remember?
Phantom Menace. Yeah,
Very
it came
fun.
out, the Phantom Menace came out on my 15th birthday, actually. So I definitely
Good
remember going to
birthday
see that
present.
one. It was amazing. It was a great birthday present.
That must have been interesting writing Queen's Peril with all of the gaps in between the film scenes, because obviously it's a very tight time frame, so it has
Yes.
to all match.
Yeah, and Disney Plus had just become a thing, and I joked that like I had been able to like write it off on my taxes immediately because the first thing I did was like scene hop through the Phantom Menace for several hours while I was like going over stuff in the book.
So obviously you've written Star Wars projects that include a wide variety of characters, but if you could write about any Star Wars character in the future, do you have anyone in mind?
Um, kind of. It's always a little bit hard to answer that question because I love so many of the characters, but also because I don't usually talk about my pitches like
Fair.
openly. So obviously there's characters I'd love to return to, there's characters I'd like to write more of. I did leave several doors open in the Qi'ra book for a sequel if anybody was interested. So that would probably be the most obvious one, but there are so many characters that I love in Star Wars, and I love getting ideas for Star Wars too, so that's always fun as well.
I did notice that like there's several of your works that like kind of there's mall that could have been there, but almost didn't quite, and so there's doors to be explored.
Yeah,
Uh,
sometimes you ask when people are like, "Oh, what time period does Crimson Climb cover?" My answer is always it starts just after they get separated to spaceports and ends about 10 seconds before she meets Darth Maul for the first time. Because when I asked if I could have Darth Maul, story group was like, no. And I was like, fine.
yeah, that's we had a lot of fun as Wikipedians trying to figure out when it took place and which well this chapter must take place around this year. It's very interesting stuff. Um, and Alira recently appeared in Star Wars Outlaws, which is interesting how
Yes.
your work is slowly bleeding into other projects.
That was actually the other way around because Outlaws already existed, like they knew the character existed.
Oh, okay.
But they couldn't tell me anything about her. So it's just like, here's a super vague description. Could you like put her in a scene? And I was like, doing what? They're like, we don't care. So I think I saw like a very early sketch of
Oh,
her. But I didn't even know what she was for. They were like, they said a game character, and I thought they meant the tournament one. So like that's how vague it is sometimes. Like
I'm
they didn't
glad
even
the
tell me.
species and
Yeah,
everything
they
got
didn't even tell me
correct.
what they didn't even tell me what game it was from. They just said a game character, and I was like, well, that leaves a lot of opportunities. So
There was one small deep Easter egg in Crimson Climb about the noodles, and it matches the name of the planet from the Acolyte. So that's another thing that a lot of us were speculating about. Like, is it? Is it the first reference to Ueda? Very interesting.
sometimes I just get things off of Wikipedia, honestly, where I need a name for something, so I look it up, and then I'm just like, okay, I don't really know what this is, but it's on the internet, so
So Crimson Climb, it does focus on a lot of time of Kira's time after she's like recaptured. So what was your process for looking at other material and then tying it into an original story? Because obviously there was Most Wanted and the solo novelization, I believe.
hmm.
So your
Sorry.
research process, I guess.
So that was pretty much the two of the main sources. So the first was Most Wanted by Ray Carson, which I read when it came out and adored it. The second was the movie novelization by Mur Lafferty, which has two really important scenes that either were never in the movie or got cut. I'm not actually sure. I imagine they were never in the movie. Um, mostly between L3 and Qi'ra. So a lot of the development that came for Qi'ra's character came from that scene, sort of her building up towards it. And then the whole Sarkin subplot came from the movie novelization as well. And then the other major source was Charles Soule's comic run, the Crimson Climb comics, which Crimson Rain. Everything's crimson, and then I always forget what the second word is.
And then Crimson
The
Dawn, which is in
Yeah,
everything as well.
The Crimson Dawn comic books. There we go. Crimson Rain might have been the last one. I honestly cannot recall. And those were like the things that everything has to land on. So like I can't do anything that conflicts with that with Charles's stuff, even though it hasn't happened yet in Qi'ra's timeline because she has to get there eventually. And the thing from Charles's books that probably came in the most handy was her ability to track down Sith artifacts for Darth Maul and how that got started. So I was able to sort of incorporate that into Crimson Climb as like the beginning of that.
You mentioned that the Sarkin subplot was one pulled, and obviously Sarkin was not really mentioned that much outside of Crimson Line. He got a lot more development there. So what was that like? Because I know she struggled a lot with like I I'm an independent person. She wears that dress and she's like in any other circumstance I would love to wear this dress, but
Yeah.
because I'm enslaved, I'm not feeling it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it too, is that a lot of Kira's mentality and her driving force is like, is this survivable? Can I survive this? And how do I survive this? And that's kind of where she ends up. But in this moment with Sarkin, when she's so like it's the process of all of her hopes being crushed, basically. Like she had believed Han. She had thought for sure this was going to work, that their plan was going to succeed, they were going to be free, it was going to be maybe not great but like nice-ish. And then it just went completely the other direction. So even though she kind of has this thing that she'd always kind of wanted, like food and a nice dress and all the kind of stuff, she realizes now what the cost is for that, in terms of her own personal freedom. And when she gets it again with Dryden Voss, she is determined that it won't be the same this time, that she's going to do what she can to make it different this time.
To keep it, I
Yeah.
suppose. I did find it really interesting that how she kept the dice safe for all those years came into it. Like, I didn't think that's pretty inventive, keeping it in your mouth so that people aren't taking it, because she obviously got everything taken from her, right at
Yeah.
the start there.
Yeah, that was one thing where you have this thing, then you're like, okay, this is not huge, but you still have to carry it with you the whole time. And obviously at the beginning when she's being searched, you're like, where are you going to put this? You have several limited options, and I feel like your mouth is the easiest one, because it all also helps her not scream, which is important at that point as well.
As you said, she always puts herself first, and this kind of hardens her, I guess, in a lot of ways. So there's two characters, Jaglia and Emma, that come into play. She leaves Jaglia behind, and she leaves Emma to be mauled. How did those two things get developed? Just part of her arc.
Jaglia is a character from the Most Wanted books, so or the Most Wanted book rather. So I sort of drew on that, and um, Jaglia had kind of imagined that they would have this relationship that Han and Qi'ra had had, and Qi'ra is like, "No, I'm not doing that again, but I will use this person who thinks I'm doing that." And Emma was basically her replacement. And she's obviously pretty angry about that. There's nothing she can do about it. But she's not going to help, obviously, if something does happen. And when it comes to her ability to save herself, that's really kind of the first time she is able to save herself, and she's definitely punching down. Like it's not like she's going up against an opponent who would beat her. Like there's
Right.
no way, this
But
is a
she's still
child.
climbing up and only
But
thinking
she's
of
still
herself.
climbing up and only thinking of herself. And I think Emma in a lot of ways was the turning point for that, where she realizes what she can do.
I do notice that, like, even though she's obviously sold to Sarkis at some point, she's still like thinking ahead, stealing from Imperial as whatnot. Uh, it's just very interesting to see her try to get ahead, still thinking ahead, and then because you see that. I think you mentioned in the book that scrum rats don't usually stay with Proxima past a certain age. There was a big purge, and the older ones all kind of die off.
Yeah.
So where did that concept come from?
I think that's also Most Wanted. I
That they
don't
just don't blast past a certain age,
well,
which I
they're
thought was
like
really,
strongly encouraged to leave or like mysterious things happen to them. Um
yeah.
from the oh, I just remembered another source that I used was Midnight Horizon by Daniel Jose Older, one of the High Republic books, where it is very strongly implied that Grindelwalds eat people. And not so much strongly implied as like outright stated. And so there's lots of ways for scrum rats to go missing when they get old, or older, I guess, like 24, if we're really pushing the upper limit. But the long and the short of it is Proxima wants children because she can control them. She can't control the adults. So they are either graduated to someone she can use or they disappear.
It's pretty interesting, yeah. Um, so Qi'ra goes on this sort of journey from Proxima, Sarkin to then moving on, but we see her on Thule for the first time get all of these material comforts that she didn't have before. So what was writing that like? Because she's someone who's been so deprived of material comforts of any form for so long, that just having her own room was crazy to her.
That was interesting for me because I tend to write a lot of sci-fi fantasy in my non-Star Wars books as well, which means I write a lot of like underdog characters who like, maybe their parents are dead or they're the chosen one, so they are rescued from the street or whatever. And so I have written a lot about, kids who suddenly have things and how that's different from people who before the kids who suddenly have things different from before, whether it's food or healthcare or whatever. And Qi'ra was unique because she has such a selfish approach to that sort of thing. Whereas all of these other people are like, okay, cool. Like, I know for sure I'm going to have breakfast tomorrow. So maybe I can help someone tonight. Whereas Qi'ra is like, well, I know I'm having breakfast tomorrow. And if I don't help someone tonight, I might also get lunch. And so she has that kind of like, she doesn't take anything for granted. She's very determined not to let that soften her at all. Because she realizes it could, that she could get comfortable and lose the edge that she has cultivated. And so she basically just decides to treat everything like it could be taken away at any moment, in part because it can, but also because she wants to keep that sort of selfish edge. And most characters I've written up to that point aren't like that. So Qi'ra was kind of an adventure, to write somebody who really just takes what they want because they want it, not because they need it necessarily.
I mean, in comparison, Padme, for all of her, she has so much material stuff, like
Yeah,
stuff. She's never for want of
no,
anything really. So, divergence. I did
yeah,
see that a lot in Kara, though. She's at a dinner table just watching people pass around bowls of food, like calmly, which
yeah.
I think is it revelation to her. Like, oh, people can sit at a dinner table and just pass around a food bowl.
Yeah.
Um, but we also see some like power dynamics between the crew on Thule. So I was curious what that was like because obviously she's not trying to necessarily one up anyone on Thule, at least not immediately, but somehow it happens and she has to deal with that power dynamic. So what was exploring that like? Because obviously she gets to the top eventually, so I'm assuming it was building towards her eventually becoming Dryden DeLoss's lieutenant and moving up in the ranks.
Um, Definitely. When she, in Most Wanted, when she and Han and the Rhodian, whose name I always forget, are going up against each other for gang leader, essentially. Han is very much like, oh, it'll be great. Like, whoever wins, we'll just take care of each other. It'll be fine. And Kira's like, I'm gonna win. I don't care if like I have to sell my soul or possibly yours. I am winning this, which eventually she does for that exact reason. And I think that that's sort of her realizing that this time she can build a similar power structure, even though she's coming in from the outside. So she's decided she wants to be at the top. She doesn't want to be um, taking orders from too many people because she doesn't want to be that vulnerable again. And so the idea that she's going to raise herself up and the fact that Trivedi already kind of doesn't like her, really sort of pays off.
What do you think that Dryden sees in Kira that he appreciates as an underling. Because when the first time they meet, he looks at her and he's like, I want her. Where did
I
that come
think
from?
I think he sees because she makes it happen. He sees someone that he can control and that he can sort of mold into this like perfect lieutenant. And Qi'ra is extremely happy to play that part for as long as it suits her. And we see her do it on screen in the solo movies. And then when she reaches her limit, and that's it. And she's basically willing to take anything that he'll give her, um, and kind of surprise what's coming next. And when he doesn't realize what he's in for. So I think he sees something that he wants to see in her, and she's letting him see it in a lot of cases, but she's not letting him see the real version of her.
I did notice there are some parts of when she's getting dressed up, she's like, I don't need to wear these clothes, but I do, and I look very professional in them, basically. Which I think is an aspect probably pulled from Solo as well. She puts a lot of care into her appearance. Her
Yes.
wardrobe was fantastic in that film.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's part of it too, is that she's always playing a part. Even when she's just with Trinia, who may or may not be able to read her mind, she's always playing a part. She's never just being herself. And the only person she was ever herself with was Han, and that went badly. And so she's decided basically that she's always going to be playing this part. And now she gets to wear nice clothes and fancy jewelry and eat good food as part of it. And that's really just kind of a perk as to how she's kind of chosen to spend the rest of her life.
Corinna was also a really complex character. She was ambitious, trying to overthrow Dryden. But her character development, I think I read in a Star Wars.com interview, was a bit interesting because she was like a culmination of several different characters or something. So how did that
Yes.
come about?
So the first draft of this book was very different. Specifically, that Corinna was much more of a minor character. She still did what she did, but it was much more of a minor subplot. And the alien whose species name I'm currently forgetting, starts with an M. I picked it and then realized that the species doesn't have names. So it's just referred to as the whatever the species is for the entire book. And I was like, thanks, Claudia. Claudia Gray invented that one. Good job, team. Um, Miski, I forget. Anyway, so that character and Sarkin were all those. So those three characters were all singularly played by Val, from the Solo movie, who was a much more major character in the book. And then Story Group was like, "You can't have Val," and I was like, "Oh dear."
So
She's very
lots of
central to this
rewriting.
book. She's very central to this book's plot. And so I kind of had to go through and take her out, and it resulted in Sarkin, and it resulted in the alien whose name I keep forgetting, and it resulted in Corinna's part being much bigger.
Corinna was also part of Kira getting her tattoo, which I thought was a really interesting scene to include because she has that very prominent tattoo in the film. So how did that come into
That was
play?
another second draft. It came about in a second draft. Um, Jen, my editor, had originally requested a scene where Qi'ra gets her tattoo in the draft, and I'd forgotten, which was why it wasn't in the first draft. And so when we went to do the second draft, Jen was like, "Oh, and if you could like find a scene where she like gets her tattoo, I think like that could maybe help now that we know where to put it. And I also think she should kill more people." And I was like, "Okay." And so I decided she was gonna kill this guy in front of Dryden. And as I often do, I went to Wikipedia and like looked up an alien name, and at random picked the one alien that squirts ink when it's confronted with violence. And I
Meant to
was
be.
like, oh dear, here we go. So when I wrote that scene, I was like, I don't know, this might be a little bit too far. And the notes from Story Group get like progressively more horrified as we go as we go through that book. I think they had a very different picture of who I am as a person after we wrote that book than before. But no, apparently murdering a dude and then tattooing him yourself with his self-defense mechanism ink was not a bridge too far. So we that stayed in
I
the book.
2023 was a dark year for Star Wars because Inquisitor Rise of the Red Blade came out, and that book is
Yep.
dark.
Yep.
So
I realized, and like, I didn't realize that Delilah had a book at the same time because our timelines are vastly different in terms of when we're writing. But when I was writing Crimson Climb, frequently I was like, what would Delilah do when I was like putting things together? So it's very much my Delilah Dawson book. And it coming out at the same time as Rise of the Red Blade, I was like, oh boy, people are going to be
both
really
were,
in for it if they're reading these back to back.
yeah. I was writing some comparisons because I've actually written several of the Wikipedia articles for some of the characters in this, and it's very dark. It's very interesting because we all would look over each other's works, and some of the people are like, "Are you okay? Why are you writing about all of this all day?" It's very
Yeah.
um. So near the end of the book, we see Dryden Voss has Qi'ra hunting Force artifacts. So did that come into play as an early story idea that you wanted to include in the book as like the end of the novel?
Yes.
It was like
I
the
wanted her to be, and it's all part of her like social climbing plan that she doesn't really have, but like she's willing to develop as it comes along. So Voss gets her to do this because he trusts her because he thinks he can control her. And Qi'ra will do it because it gets her in with the person above Voss. So she knows that if she can do this, if she can become the person that is relied upon for this, not only will Voss like her, the person above Voss will like her. And by process of elimination, she has at this point figured out a few things about who this shadowy figure must be. Um, and she knows how dangerous he is, but she also knows that it's much more dangerous to be in his bad books than it is to be in his good books. So she is quite willing to become the person who is tracking this stuff down. On a personal note, however, I wanted to write an Indiana Jones style murder temple where like they go in and like rooms filled with sand and there's like spike traps and like all that kind of stuff. And so I was like, you know what? She's gonna get a thing and everyone's gonna die. I
and
actually had
there
to go
was
back.
death. There
I
was a
actually
lot of
had to
death in
go.
that
I had to
mission.
go back and like unkill someone because I realized I
Oh,
didn't have anyone to fly the shuttle. I was like, oh wait, none of these people can fly. It was awesome. I had a lot of
uh,
fun.
but yeah, it's really interesting to see like that a lot of the people in the book they end up dead. I'm most surprised that we didn't see her going back to kill Proxima, quite honestly. Um, but this really does prepare her for when she goes, I guess, to right up to the moment of the film where she's like, I've had to do a lot of things that you wouldn't understand. Because
Yeah,
Han's like, I don't understand why, like, what could you have possibly done that's so bad that you just wouldn't get? And it's like, she's like, well, I didn't just murder a whole bunch, like, I just murdered a bunch of people and I've done
yeah.
some
I
really
didn't
bad
just murder
things.
people. I made sure they got murdered. There's a slight
I made
difference
sure they
there,
got murdered and I helped plan
and
it.
I helped
And
do it.
were there any other film elements or Easter eggs that you like particularly loved type tucking into the book?
Yes. So in the going back to the murder temple, I decided I was gonna have it be built out of Lego for the Lego Star Wars. Because first of all, Lego Star Wars is the best Star Wars. If you haven't seen Lego Star Wars, it is outstanding. Everyone should watch it. It is my favorite. Like the droid tales all the way right through the Freemaker adventures, they're all amazing. But the thing that I loved the most about the Freemaker adventures was that the Star Wars lore and the Lego universe building lore merged together really nicely in terms of how the Force works. And I was like, okay, I can use that. So when I was writing the temple, I had the Lego pyramid on hand. And when Egyptians built the pyramid, they built the whole thing and then cut the tunnel. Um, but when the Lego people did it, they had to do it the other way around. They had to build the tunnels as empty spaces and then have it be shaped like a pyramid when they got to the edge, which involves some engineering. And so I think there's a line in the book about how like, oh, no one could have done that. You would have to be a master builder, which is like what they're called in the Lego universe. And so the Jedi who had created this artifact that Qi'ra is after and had built this temple was a master builder, and he had gone for all of this. And at first I was like, oh, if Story Groups asks, I'm gonna say it's mortise and tenon, which is like a kind of building technique where it looks a lot like Lego. It's just made out of stone and you carve it. But they didn't say no, and now the book's published. So now I'm like, it's Lego, everybody. It's definitely Lego.
That's the interesting thing is like how much can you put in and it stays?
No,
How much can you
you
get
can't
it?
have Darth Maul or Val, but you can have Lego Star Wars.
Were there any of the other Star Wars books that you tried to get Maul into and it just didn't quite make it?
Yes, he is not in the Ahsoka book. Well, I mean, he's at the beginning, but he's there was another scene with him later on that got cut. And then he didn't get cut at all from any of the scenes that I had him in Queen's Peril. So that's
Well,
pretty good.
that's a time frame that I guess would make
Yeah.
sense, but
Yes.
yeah. Um, I'm pleased to hear that you do look at Wikipedia on occasion, though.
I I don't know if you know this, but whenever there's a convention, and I'm on a panel with Timothy's on, and someone is like, how do you come up with names or blah 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 whatever. Tim's like, well, what I do is I go on Wookieepedia and I find a planet that doesn't have much of an entry. So like it has a name, but it doesn't have much of an entry, which means it hasn't been in a story before. And then he just uses that one. And I was like, I also do that. So like I think most of us, just because it's the best source, frankly, to find things. But it is pretty funny sometimes for someone to be like, oh, how'd you know that? I'm like, I looked it up on Wikipedia.
Um, and so, kind of moving on from Crimson Climb, do you have any other upcoming projects that you're really excited that you'd like to talk about and let readers know to look
Yeah,
for?
so next year I have two more sci-fi books. One is called Titan of the Stars. It's kind of like Alien meets Titanic in space. So, rich people, poor people, one ship, many people getting eaten from the inside out. And then the second book I have next year is called Sky on Fire, and it is a sequel to my 2021 book Etherbound. And it's also a sci-fi. It's more of a space opera though. There's like magic involved. And it's a little bit more dealing with rebellion that started at the end of Etherbound.
What platforms should people catch up with you on to see what you're up
Um,
to?
Mostly I'm on Instagram, which is at EK_Johnston. I'm on Tumblr with no underscore, just EK Johnston. And then I do have a newsletter on Substack. If people want to subscribe to that, they can find that through my Instagram is probably the easiest way.
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with us. It was
No problem.
lovely. And
I had fun.
Wikipedia thanks you. And a lot of this will work its way onto the articles. So,
Excellent.
right,
Thank you
so
very much.